Good morning, lovelies. Today we're going to be talking about how to create fantasy and alien races. Not their cultures, that's a whole other thing, but instead their biology. This video is part of my ongoing world building playlist where each video talks about a different piece of world building, which means if you do want to learn about creating the culture of your fictional race, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss out on those videos. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. All those links are in the description. Okay, so no video on fantasy or sci-fi races would be complete without at least mentioning the classics. These classic races were mostly codified by Tolkien. We've since not really expanded on them all that much, but they do bear repeating. First of all, we got humans because we're self-centered jerks and we need to put ourselves at the center of every single story. We also have those long-lived, ancient, better than humans races like elves and Vulcans. These can be subdivided into other races like wood elves and magical asshole elves with posh British accents that I cannot repeat because I suck at accents. We also have the mining and crafting race, usually some sort of dwarf, and we also have, of course, the evil race, orcs, goblins, Romulans, whatever. This is the most problematic one since the idea of an entire race of people being evil or barbaric has some spicy real-world notes that we should probably avoid. There's nothing wrong with using the old classics, especially if you plan on doing a new spin on it. For example, the Dragon Prince has several different types of elves, but they're not like wood elf and magic high elf or whatever. Instead, they're moon elves and sun elves, where each subrace draws power and different types of powers from their respective source. Or let's say you really like the aesthetic of Tolkien-esque elves, wood elves, high elves, whatever. Maybe the magical asshole elves decide that the world would be better if they conquered it, since they're clearly superior to everyone else in every way. Please give me a fantasy novel with evil elves. Thank you. But let's say you've clicked on this video because you want to create a totally new original race. How do you do it? Some authors simply mash humans with an animal and call it good, which is totally fine. This is how we get angels, mermaids, centaurs, that type of thing. You can choose a whole new type of animal that people aren't used to seeing, like insects or lizards. Or you can mash humans with a fantasy creature, which is how we got Dragonborn, a staple of Dungeons & Dragons. And if you're writing fantasy especially, you can be as weird and magical as you want. But if you want a fantasy or alien race that's more grounded in realism, there are some things to consider. Number 1, environment. Every living creature, humans included, evolves to survive and thrive in their specific environment. So ask yourself, how does your environment affect the evolution of your fictional race? The first problem is breathing. How do they breathe? Now, this might sound a little silly, but it is important, especially if, say, your planet is entirely covered in ocean. And if your race is like merfolk type, we gotta ask yourself, are they mammals like whales or dolphins that can hold their breath for a very long time, or do they have gills? This will affect how their architecture is built, because no merfolk will want to live in an underground city or building that does not have easy access to the surface if they need to breathe air. You also have temperature to consider, hot or cold. If it is a very hot climate, then they might be cold-blooded, or have scales, or sweat easily, or do something to keep themselves cool. But if it is a particularly icy climate, then they're probably going to have thick fur, or blubber, or something that's going to keep them warm and keep them from freezing to death. Then there's transportation. Do they walk, fly, swim, hop? Magically teleport? How do they get around? How do they hunt food? How do they get to safety? What do they do? And then of course you have universal pressures. Gravity is often weirdly overlooked, but it plays a really important role that I honestly am not qualified to talk about because I don't study that. Another pressure is suns. If they have 3 different suns, is there ever a night? And if there's no night, well, they probably can't see very well, if at all, in the dark. They might have a totally different way of seeing or vision. Moons will affect your tides and a couple of other factors, so maybe the entire planet is covered in water, or at least most of it, during high tide, and then at low tide it retreats back, or something crazy like that. You also have to think about how long are the days, months, or years. Does the planet even rotate, or is it tidally locked? I'm not a scientist at all. I explicitly avoided science classes in high school and college because they were so freaking boring. So I'm going to link the channel Artifixian in the description because he tackles every part of the world building process from a purely scientific angle in exhaustive detail. It's in the description. Once you've got environment figured out, number 2, food. What and how do they eat? Are they carnivores or herbivores? Or are they plant people who can create food through photosynthesis? Who do they have to compete with their food? Obviously, members of the same species compete with each other for food and resources, but we also have to consider members of similar species. If they're hunters, what other hunters are in the area? On a similar note, what specific resources do they need to survive? Something like farmland, clean water, shelter, like how big does their territory have to be for that? For example, let's say we got a race of cat-descended people, which would be carnivorous. So to secure food sources, maybe they would create hatcheries, fish farms. This would require a very large water source, lakes, rivers, streams, maybe parts of the ocean, whatever. Their societies would be built around these places and they may have to defend them against neighboring societies of cat people. Number 3, protection. How do they defend themselves? Not just against other creatures, but also in intense weather. For example, in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, a lot of the creatures there have evolved like super hard shells, or the opposite, being able to be lightly tossed and turned by the wind without sustaining damage, because the storms there are so horrible. When faced with a fight, does your fictional race try to avoid them entirely by running away or camouflaging themselves? Or do they have super hard impenetrable shells like turtle people? Or maybe they're fierce predators with claws and teeth and they fight. Are they solitary, or perhaps they know there's power in numbers, like herd or pack animals? If so, what do they look for in a leader? How are their groups structured to maximize their protection? Humans are an evolutionary oddity with this one. Rather than evolve better teeth or claws for hunting, we evolved in a way that let us create tools and form strategies. Our thumbs and our brains are direct results of evolution. You can get more creative with the evolution of your fantasy race too, throwing in magic, which we will talk about later. Number 4, reproduction. Do they reproduce like people do, or in some other way, like reptilian eggs or amoebas? Do they just like clone themselves, split off? Like what goes on? How do they continue the population? How often is reproduction? Do they have the 9-month gestation period like with humans, or is it like 2 weeks, or maybe once every 7 years if you're feeling Vulcan-y, whatever? How many kids are born at any one time? Is it usually just one or a whole litter of them? This, of course, leads to the natural segue of sex and gender. How many sexes are there? Just male and female, which by the way is a lot more complicated than you think. Or is there a third sex, or is there just one? Does one of these sexes have more social or physical power than the others? What do they find attractive in a mate? Are there certain mating rituals that have to be observed? Are certain sexes more colorful or have extra appendages to attract a partner? Do they form emotional bonds with their mates, maybe staying with them for a really long time? Or is it more of a one-night stand type of thing? This is honestly one of the most fascinating aspects, I think, in creating a culture and world building, and we are going to be dedicating an entire video to this at some point. But for now, we got to move on. Number 5, lifespans. Do they live as long as mayflies, like 5 minutes, or are they immortal? Generally speaking, shorter lifespans means faster metabolisms, which means they'd have to eat more frequently. This is also going to directly affect how many people in this race there are and how often they reproduce as a natural form of population control. Shorter-lived species reproduce more frequently with more kids at once, while longer-lived species are more likely to have fewer children. Obviously, there are outliers, but this is the general trend. I won't go into depth here, but it's worth keeping in mind what impact lifespan will have on their culture, not just their biology. Immortal elf-like people won't have a YOLO culture going on because they live forever, unless otherwise killed. They're more likely to take things slow, be chill, and unhurried. They might not even have something called a bucket list. Whereas a society of more mayfly type people that have super short lifespans are gonna probably be more full throttle. Like, I have literally 30 minutes to live, I am going to make the most of it. Number 6, symbiotic relationships. Does your race have a mutually beneficial relationship with another species? For example, wolves eventually became dogs because of the symbiotic relationship they had with humans. We would feed them scraps from our fires, and they in turn would protect the camp, telling us when strangers were approaching or when something was going to go wrong. So how do these species help and affect each other in your world? How did this relationship start, and how has it evolved? Like, most of us don't need wolves or even really dogs around to scare off other predators or alert us to the fact that enemies are incoming, especially with modern security systems. But we still value dogs and continue to keep them around because we value their companionship. Number 7, magic and special abilities. If your fantasy race has inherent magical abilities like pyrokinesis or telepathy, ask yourself, why did they evolve such skills? Maybe underwater mermaids developed telepathy so they could communicate more elaborate and advanced thoughts. Pyrokinesis is a pretty great way to protect yourself. Who's gonna fuck with that? Number 8, subraces. Humans have evolved in a variety of different skin tones and body sizes best suited to their environments. A really fascinating example of this is the Inuit. They have biologically evolved to better withstand colder temperatures, harsher sunlight, and a near all-meat diet. You can do the same thing with your fantasy or alien race under the right circumstances, and that circumstance is usually distance and time. If they're spread over enough distance to lose contact with each other, or a group splinters off and moves to a completely different type of environment, this won't only have a cultural impact, but might even have a biological one too. For example, let's go back to our cat race example. Large cats have evolved into several different subspecies, even totally distinct species. Honestly, just lions. You have the African lions, and then you have the mountain lions. There was once a species called American lion before it got wiped out. Like, there are so many just different types of lions, to say nothing of tigers and pumas and leopards and whatever else. So you can utilize that type of thing in your fantasy race. Maybe have like a tiger subspecies of cat person that's more solitary and enjoys fishing more often. And then you have the matriarchal lion type of race where they prefer living in the savannas and hunting gazelle, and maybe they're more warrior based, or like whatever. You can go nuts with it. Number 9, arguably the most important, avoid the planet of the hats. There is no monolithic experience, even among people of the same culture. Unless your fantasy or alien race is some sort of hive mind, each individual is going to be unique. People who are from the same culture should of course have similar experiences and backgrounds. That's how a culture is formed. But how that background affects them and how they think about it should be different, as well as their opinions, attitudes, beliefs, actions, and character. Making every single member of your barbarian race a berserker barbarian warrior, or every single elf-like creature a smug asshole with magical talent, will give your work the symptom called Planet of the Hats, where a culture is boiled down to one singular trait that every single character of that race has. That's more, again, of a cultural issue than what we're talking about here, which is biology, but a lot of authors make the mistake of having one species have one culture and every single character of that species has one attitude about it. One look at humanity will tell you that that's not how it works. We might all have the shared experience of being human biologically, but everything else is different. But while stereotypes may not be accurate, they do exist, and you can use them in your story. Once you have a fully fleshed out culture, ask yourself, how do all those other cultures stereotype them? What's their hat that everyone else thinks that they all wear? How does that affect their relationship with other cultures? Biological and environmental pressures do affect culture, and it's important to consider that as you're world building. But at some point, culture moves beyond biological necessity. For example, humans have no biological need for computers or chocolate or music, but they're all important to many of our cultures, vital even. While magical and extraterrestrial traits will affect how a species and its various cultures develop, if and when they become the dominant species in the region or planet, they're going to start creating cultures that exist outside of their biological needs. Culture might even negatively affect their biology. Human beauty standards have proven to be extremely detrimental to our health, especially when it comes to women's footwear, Chinese foot binding, American high heels. Don't do it. It is so bad for us, but that doesn't stop us from glorifying it. But culture is a video for another time. Actually, several videos. I've got that whole playlist on it. So, to recap, when you're creating a new, realistic, biological race, the things to consider are environment, food, protection, reproduction, lifespan, symbiotic relationships, magical and special abilities, and subraces. If you think I missed something, let us know in the comments. If you liked this video, hit subscribe. I post every Sunday. The next video in the world building playlist is geography and climate. I don't know why I do this to myself. I am not a geologist. A special thanks to my patrons over on Patreon. If you want early access to these videos and more free goodies, come check us out on the link below. We would love to have you. And of course, the merch store is open. All the profits from that store go to helping and supporting this channel. So definitely check it out. It is linked in the description. Bye, lovelies.